Have you ever wondered who Mark was in the Bible? He is often remembered only as the author of the second gospel, but his story goes far beyond that. Mark is a figure of great importance in the formation of early Christianity, although his contribution is often seen as secondary. But who was he really? And what was the impact of his life and work on the dissemination of the teachings of Jesus? Mark, the author of the gospel that bears his name, was not one of the 12 apostles, but his spiritual journey was as significant as that of any of them. He was a second-generation disciple, someone who grew up with the stories of Jesus and had the opportunity to learn directly from those who walked alongside the Master. His role as a writer was not limited to transcribing teachings, but to capturing the essence of Christianity in a unique way, deeply connected with the humanity of Christ and the challenges of the first Christians. To better understand the figure of Mark, it is essential to delve into the historical context and origins of this man who, despite not being one of the 12 apostles, played a fundamental role in the formation of early Christianity. Mark was possibly a Hellenistic Jew, that is, a person of Jewish origin who lived in a predominantly Greek and Roman culture. This detail is important because it shaped his perspective and writing style, as well as influencing the way he related to other Christians and the world around him. In terms of his family background, the Bible does not provide many specific details about Mark's parents, but some scholars believe that he was the son of Mary, a wealthy woman well known in the early church in Jerusalem, Acts 12, verse 12. His home was a meeting place for early Christians, and this environment may have been crucial to the development of his faith. Additionally, Mark is believed to have been a relative of Barnabas, another great Christian leader, which also suggests a deep connection to early church leadership. Marcos grew up in a period of intense social and religious transformation. The Roman Empire was at its greatest expansion, and Judea, in which Mark was born, was under Roman rule. The Jewish reality of the time was marked by conflicts, political pressures, and a growing messianic desire. For many Jews, the hope was for a liberator who would free them from Roman oppression. In this setting, Mark was shaped not only by Jewish traditions, but also by Greek culture and Roman philosophy. His familiarity with these two cultures helped him to be a bridge between Judaism and nascent Christianity, especially in writing his gospel with an emphasis on Jesus as the Messiah for all, not just Jews. Throughout his life, Mark appears to have been deeply influenced by the figures of Peter and Paul. His journey of faith led him to be a dedicated disciple, although not always faithful in times of difficulty. Let's explore further how his relationship with these two early church leaders impacted his mission and contribution to Christianity. But for now, it is important to realize that Mark's context was not isolated. He was immersed in a world of great political and religious turmoil, where Jesus' message needed to be understood and transmitted in a unique way. The relationship between Marcos and Pedro is fundamental to understanding the depth of Marcos' life and mission. Although he was not one of the original apostles, Mark had the privilege of being a disciple of Peter, one of Jesus' closest apostles and one of the central figures in the history of Christianity. This relationship between them was not just a learning experience, but a deep spiritual partnership, which directly influenced the writing of Mark's gospel. Mark had direct access to the teachings of Peter, who, in turn, was one of Jesus' closest disciples. It is known that Peter later became one of the greatest preachers of Christianity, and Mark was his disciple and follower. According to tradition, Mark's gospel is largely based on Peter's preaching and testimonies about Jesus. Peter himself recognized Marcos' importance in his mission, calling him "my son," 1 Peter 5, verse 13, which shows not only the spiritual relationship, but also an emotional and mentoring bond. Peter, as leader of the early church, passed on to Mark the lessons of life and faith that he himself had learned from Jesus. Mark, in turn, had the ability to translate these experiences for the Christians of his time, especially for the Gentiles. This is reflected in the way Mark wrote his gospel, in a more direct way and without so many details specific to Judaism, something that would be more difficult for Gentile Christians to understand. His gospel, therefore, reflects Peter's testimony about the life and deeds of Jesus, but with accessible language and a clear focus on Christ's humanity, especially Jesus' suffering and death. The relationship between Mark and Peter also demonstrates an important characteristic of the early church: the collaboration between the disciples and the generations of Christians who followed the apostles. Although Mark was not one of the 12 apostles, he played a vital role in passing on the teachings of Christ to future generations. The connection between them highlights the importance of each disciple and their collaboration in missionary work. Mark not only listened to Peter's accounts, but also turned them into a living and inspiring testimony for the Christians of that day. Furthermore, the friendship between Mark and Peter reveals something essential for all Christians: the need for mentors and spiritual guides along our journey of faith. Mark's trajectory, learning from Peter and then transmitting these teachings, is a clear example of how the Christian faith is passed on from generation to generation through shared teachings and living examples of faith. If you're enjoying exploring the story of Mark and his connection to Peter, why not share your thoughts in the comments below? What do you think about the importance of spiritual mentors in our journey of faith? Mark and Peter show how we can grow and share our faith with the support of those who guide us. If you are following this journey and want to continue learning more about Mark's life and the gospel, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Together, we can continue to explore the powerful lessons the Bible has to teach us. The Gospel of Mark is, without a doubt, one of the most impactful and essential works of the New Testament. Although the author is not one of the 12 apostles, the importance of his testimony about the life of Jesus cannot be underestimated. As a disciple of Peter, Mark had access to direct, personal accounts of the events in Christ's life, and it was this connection that allowed him to write a gospel that was both a faithful narrative and a teaching tool for Christian communities. The Gospel of Mark is often considered the oldest of the 4 canonical Gospels, and its date of authorship is generally placed between the years 60 and 70 AD. This places it at a critical period in Christian history, shortly after the death of Jesus and at a time when the early church was beginning to expand beyond Jerusalem and Judea. Mark wrote to a predominantly Gentile community, made up of Christians who, although with faith in Jesus, did not share the same Jewish cultural background. Therefore, his gospel is particularly accessible to this audience, focusing on the universality of Christ's message. One of the most notable features of Mark's gospel is its direct and dynamic writing. Compared to the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, Mark is more concise and often dramatic in his style. He presents Jesus as an active figure who performs miracles, teaches with authority, and faces opposition with courage. Furthermore, Mark does not focus much on the details of Jesus' words, but on his actions, which reinforces the message of a Christ who is always on the move, fulfilling his mission of bringing the kingdom of God to earth. A central theme in Mark's gospel is the suffering of Jesus. Mark emphasizes Christ's humanity, showing his emotions, his doubts, and above all, his suffering on the cross. This focus on Jesus' suffering is one of the reasons why Mark's gospel is so impactful, especially for Christian communities who were being persecuted and martyred at the time. Mark, by emphasizing the suffering of Christ, provided a model of perseverance for Christians in times of adversity. Another important aspect of Mark's gospel is the idea of the secret Messiah. In several passages, Jesus asks his followers not to reveal his messianic identity immediately. This may seem strange at first, considering that Jesus is, in fact, the Messiah, but this approach has a deep theological reason. Marcos was trying to correct the popular idea of a triumphant Messiah who would come to overthrow Israel's political enemies. On the contrary, Mark presents Jesus as a Messiah who, instead of defeating his enemies with political or military power, sacrifices himself for them. This reversal of messianic expectations was revolutionary, as it challenged conventional views of what the Messiah should be. Furthermore, the Gospel of Mark is considered a gospel of action. His narratives are fast and dynamic, with frequent transitions that indicate Jesus' constant movement. The word immediately is used more than 40 times throughout the text, reinforcing this sense of urgency and action. This reflects Jesus' urgent mission to spread the gospel of salvation and call people to repentance and faith. Another important point is the relationship between Jesus and his disciples. Mark does not omit the disciples' failures, such as their unbelief and Jesus' abandonment during his arrest and crucifixion. This serves to remind readers that, like the disciples, we are all flawed and often make mistakes on our journey of faith. However, Mark's story also highlights how, even after their failures, the disciples were restored and continued Christ's mission, showing that God's grace is stronger than our mistakes. Finally, the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus are the culmination of Mark's gospel. Mark dedicates a large part of his gospel to the Passion narrative, presenting Christ's death as a necessary sacrifice for the salvation of humanity. The resurrection of Jesus, which Mark describes briefly and powerfully, is the final seal that Christ's work has been accomplished and that he has triumphed over death. In short, the Gospel of Mark is a powerful and accessible account of the life of Jesus. His direct, action-packed writing, combined with his emphasis on Christ's suffering and humanity, offers a unique and crucial portrait for understanding the ministry of Jesus and the mission of the early church. As modern Christians, we can learn a lot from Mark's Gospel, especially about the urgency and courage of living our faith with perseverance, even in the face of adversity. Although Mark's Gospel is a powerful account of the life of Christ, Mark's own life was not without flaws and difficulties. In fact, Marcos' trajectory, marked by moments of failure and overcoming, is one of the most inspiring parts of his story. As we reflect on these failures, we can see how they shaped not only the author of the Gospel, but also how his life became an example of perseverance and divine grace for us all. The first major episode of failure in Mark's life is recorded in the book of Acts of the Apostles. Mark joined Paul and Barnabas' mission, but halfway through the journey, he decided to return to Jerusalem, abandoning the mission. Acts 13, verse 13. This act of desertion was seen as a great failure, and it led to a major rift between Paul and Barnabas. Paulo, who was known for his firmness and commitment to the mission, was unhappy with Marcos' decision to abandon the trip. As a result, when Barnabas wanted to give Mark a second chance on a subsequent mission, Paul refused. This resulted in Paul and Barnabas separating, with each going his own direction. This episode shows that Marcos, although committed to God's mission, was still a man in process. He wasn't perfect, and his flaws didn't go unnoticed by others. However, the fact that he continued his journey of faith even after this embarrassing episode reveals the resilient character he possessed. He did not let himself be defeated by criticism and disapproval, and over time, he was restored and reconnected with God's mission. The restoration of Marcos is one of the most inspiring aspects of his story. Although Paul initially doubted his ability, Mark did not give up his call. Years later, we see a significant change in Paul's attitude towards Mark. In his letter to Timothy, Paul specifically asks that Mark be brought to him, stating that he is useful for the ministry. 2 Timothy 4 verse 11. This public recognition of Mark's restoration is a powerful testimony to God's grace, which can restore anyone, regardless of their past failures. It is important to note that Marcos' failure was not a permanent impediment to his mission. In fact, his personal difficulties made him an even more relevant example for Christians of the time, and for us today. His story demonstrates that even when we fail, God does not abandon us. He uses our mistakes and our struggles as part of his divine plan, and restoration is always possible as long as we stay true to our mission. This narrative of failure and restoration is a clear reflection of how God works in our lives. We all go through difficult times, make mistakes, and face challenges that can make us question our purpose. However, as we saw in Mark's life, true victory comes when we persevere, even when others doubt us, and allow God to use us for his great plans. Mark's contribution to Christianity goes far beyond the gospel he wrote. Although his name appears in few passages in the New Testament, his impact on the spread of the Christian faith and the formation of the doctrines we know today is undeniable. As a disciple of Peter and author of one of the 4 canonical Gospels, Mark played a crucial role in consolidating Jesus' message for future generations. The way he conveyed the life and teachings of Christ shaped the early Christian faith and continues to influence the way we understand the Bible to this day. Firstly, the Gospel of Mark served as one of the main sources for the other Gospels. In fact, most scholars believe that both Matthew and Luke drew on the Gospel of Mark when writing their own accounts. This makes Mark a central figure in the construction of the New Testament, as his work became a point of reference for other sacred writers. His unique perspective, focused on the action of Christ and the intensity of his sufferings, brought a vision of Jesus that complements and, at the same time, expands the approaches of other evangelists. Furthermore, Mark played an important role in the evangelization of Gentiles, that is, people who were not Jewish. The early Christian community, made up mostly of Jews, initially did not know how to communicate effectively with Gentiles. Mark, writing in a Gentile context, was a bridge between these two cultures. He used accessible language and avoided many of the more complex Jewish references that appear in other Gospels. His gospel was an attempt to explain the teachings of Jesus to an audience that did not have the same religious and cultural background as the Jews, making the Christian message more universal and accessible. Mark also had a significant impact on the development of theological understanding of the Messiah. While other Gospels, especially Matthew, emphasize the fulfillment of messianic prophecies, Mark presents a Jesus who, despite being the Messiah, does not behave according to traditional Jewish expectations. Mark's secret Messiah, who often asks people not to reveal his identity, challenges the idea of a warrior Messiah who would free the Jews from Roman oppression. Instead, Mark reveals a Messiah who suffers, serves, and dies to redeem humanity, offering a new perspective on the Messiah's role in the divine plan. The way Mark writes about Christ's suffering also profoundly influenced the Christian understanding of human suffering. At a time of great persecution for Christians, Mark's gospel served as a source of comfort and strength. Jesus' suffering on the cross was interpreted by many early Christians as a model to be followed in times of tribulation. Thus, the Gospel of Mark not only recounts the events of Jesus' life, but also offers a practical theology about how Christians should deal with suffering and adversity. Furthermore, Mark's contribution to the early church was not limited to his authorship of the Gospel. He is also mentioned in several letters of Paul and Peter, which indicates that Mark was deeply involved in missionary work and the spread of the Gospel. In Colossians 4 verse 10, Paul mentions Mark as a brother and colleague in the ministry, and in 1 Peter 5 verse 13, Peter refers to Mark as his son, which suggests a relationship of closeness and trust. This indicates that Mark was a respected leader and a faithful collaborator in the work of building the Christian church. Mark's importance can also be seen in the fact that, at the end of his life, he was one of the first Christians to evangelize in the Alexandria region of Egypt. Christian tradition holds that Mark founded the Church of Alexandria, one of the oldest and most influential Christian communities in the world, and that his influence extended throughout North Africa. As a leader and preacher, Mark helped solidify the foundations of the Christian church outside of Palestine, spreading the message of Jesus to new peoples and cultures. Ultimately, Mark's contribution to Christianity was much more than just writing a gospel. He was a spiritual leader, a dedicated missionary, and an example of perseverance in the face of adversity. His life and work have continued to impact millions of Christians around the world, serving as a testimony to the grace of God that can transform flawed lives into powerful instruments of His will. Mark's legacy is not limited to just the historical impact of his gospel or his direct contribution to the spread of the Christian faith. His life, marked by failures, overcoming, and perseverance, holds powerful lessons for modern Christians, regardless of where they are on their spiritual journey. When we look at Mark's trajectory, we see an ordinary man with his own weaknesses and challenges, but also a man transformed by God's grace and by fidelity to the divine calling. One of the most obvious lessons we can learn from Marcos is the importance of not allowing past mistakes to define our future. Mark, as we saw previously, began his journey with significant failures, such as when he abandoned the mission with Paul and Barnabas. For many, this could have been the end of their participation in the ministry. But Marcos didn't let that stop him from continuing. On the contrary, he rose and was restored, becoming one of the main collaborators in the advancement of the gospel. This teaches us that our failures are not the end of the story. If we remain humble and willing to learn from our mistakes, God can use them as part of His divine plan. Mark's story also teaches us about the importance of perseverance. At a time when Christians were facing severe persecution and many were being martyred for their faith, Mark did not give up. Even in the face of personal difficulties and disagreements with other church leaders, he remained steadfast in his mission. This is especially relevant for modern Christians, who, although they do not face such intense persecution, often face daily challenges that test their faith. Mark's perseverance serves as a reminder that, even in adversity, we must remain focused on the divine purpose given to us. Furthermore, Mark teaches us about the importance of being shaped by spiritual mentors. His relationship with Pedro was fundamental to his formation as a leader and writer. Peter, with his experience of being a direct disciple of Jesus, offered Mark a solid foundation of teaching and example. This reflects the need for all of us to have spiritual mentors in our lives, people who can guide, correct, and inspire us to live according to Christian principles. A mentor's wisdom and advice can be critical to our spiritual growth and our ability to serve God more effectively. Another crucial aspect of Mark's legacy is his focus on suffering as part of God's plan. In Mark's gospel, Christ's suffering is not just a painful passage, but a necessity for the salvation of humanity. It challenges us to understand the suffering in our own lives in a new way. Although suffering is not something we seek out, the Bible teaches us that God can use it to shape us, strengthen our faith, and draw us closer to Him. By looking at the suffering of Jesus and Mark, we can learn to embrace difficulties with a new perspective, knowing that they can be used for a greater purpose. Marcos also leaves a legacy of humility. Although he wrote the second most important gospel in the New Testament, he did not seek to stand out or make his work something great for himself. On the contrary, he dedicated himself to serving God's mission, often in the shadow of better-known figures like Paul and Peter. His humility is a vital lesson for modern Christians, who are often tempted to seek personal recognition for their good works. Mark's example reminds us that true greatness comes from humble service to God and others, without the need for recognition or fame. Finally, Marcos' legacy challenges us to be people of action. The Gospel of Mark is, by nature, an account of movement, with an emphasis on the actions of Jesus. Jesus is portrayed as someone who performs miracles, teaches, heals, and transforms lives. For modern Christians, this is a reminder that our faith should not be static. Christianity is a faith of action, and we are called to act in the world, to live according to the teachings of Christ, to help those in need, and to share the gospel with others. Mark, then, is not just a figure from the distant past, but a model for Christians today. His legacy is a call to fidelity to God, even in difficulties, to the importance of learning from mistakes, to the need to have spiritual mentors, to understanding suffering as an opportunity for growth, and to constant action in our faith. As we reflect on Mark's life and the impact he had on Christianity, we are reminded that regardless of our position or circumstances, God can use us to accomplish great things in His name. Like Mark, we can all be God's instruments, and our failures can be used for His glory. Mark's life is a clear demonstration that, with God, all things are possible, and true and lasting transformation is always achievable. The story of Mark teaches us that God's calling is not based on personal merit, but on grace and willingness to serve. Despite his flaws and challenges, Mark was restored and used by God powerfully, demonstrating that our limitations do not prevent the fulfillment of divine purpose. His journey reflects the importance of perseverance, humility, and faithfulness, even in the face of difficulties. He inspires us to trust that God can transform our mistakes into opportunities for growth and use us to impact the world. If this message touched your heart, share this content and subscribe to the channel for more inspiring reflections. God has a unique calling for your life. Trust in Him, and leave in the comments how you plan to apply Mark's lessons in your faith journey.